Hello, and welcome to this special encore recording of synchronic and diachronic ordering in Chinese character form patterns. I'd first like to start with some gratitude for the people who gave me the money, and I'll let you decide whether or not you think I spent it wisely. A couple people gave me some comments, and hopefully eventually you will give me comments as well. So the talk is a relatively straightforward structure. So first I'll talk about my source of comparison with Chinese characters, which is phonology, and look at synchronic versus diachronic ordering in phonology. Then we'll turn to form patterns in modern Chinese characters and look at their apparent synchronic ordering of these patterns, and then look at the diachronic ordering of these patterns. And then we'll see that the diachronic ordering and synchronic orderings don't quite match, and we'll try to figure out why this might be. So as a review, phonology has been claimed to have ordering in it. This is an old idea from several decades ago. The classic example of this is raising before flapping in North American English. So this is not just Canadian English. So I'm not a Canadian, but I do have this pattern. So you can see in columns 1 and 2, you get a raising of the diphthong I to the diphthong I before a voiceless coda consonant. And in 3 and 4, you see also a rule of flapping, which makes D and T into a voiced flap in between vowels. The first vowel, second vowel is unstressed. And in column 4, you see that the two rules have to apply in a particular order, assuming that these rules are real rules. So you first raise and then you flap, because the way you pronounce a person who writes is writer, and a person who rides is a rider. That's how I pronounce it. So I must have raised the vowel before the voiceless consonant before it became voiced by the flapping rule. And this is often explained, or at least traditionally understood, as deriving from historical diachronic orders. So we'll see this is not going to work. So North American raising supposedly derives from older patterns in European English dialects, like Scottish English, and flapping supposedly emerged later in North America, just as is only just now emerging in New Zealand. Therefore, the synchronically earlier rule is supposedly the diachronically older rule, and this is supposedly always true of rule ordering. One problem with this is that diachronic explanations have an intrinsic limitation in that they are often less clear than the synchronic patterns they're supposed to be explaining. And most fundamentally, diachronic reconstructions presume plausible synchronic systems. So they're kind of a little bit circular logic. You can't use a diachronic explanation as the sole explanation for a modern thing without understanding how modern things work. Specifically, for example, Grimm's law is well known to apply before Werner's law historically, but apparently that's not necessarily true if you look at the data more carefully. About raising and flapping in particular, raising has emerged independently across English dialects, so there's no need to posit European origins for the North American patterns. And in fact, in some areas, flapping is diachronically older than raising. You can show this by historical recordings. Nevertheless, synchronically, flapping is still ordered after raising. So the diachronic and synchronic orders do not match. So we need a synchronic explanation for why the current system has the structure that it does. And I personally think the most promising approach is to just posit that different types of synchronic rules are ordered intrinsically. And if you get tricky cases where it's not obvious how they're ordered intrinsically, then they're probably not going to be very psychologically active, that order. So the productive pattern, I think, has to do with productivity. Specifically, less productive patterns look like they're applied before more productive patterns. And that would include putting phonetics last, because that's reinforced every time you use your mouth and your ears or your hands if you're signing. So both points may help explain why raising seems to precede flapping, because raising has been lexicalized. There are varieties where Canadian raising, so-called, has lexical exceptions or even quasi-phonemic contrast. By contrast, flapping is not really lexicalized, at least not very much, maybe a little bit, and it certainly has strong phonetic motivations. So that would put it at a more productive later stage of processing. So now turning to Chinese character form patterns, I've argued in a book and other places that this is analogous to phonology, just like sign language phonology is a silent formal pattern. It is purely formal. It doesn't relate to the interpretation of the written forms, but just their form. but it's not purely physics. It's a psychological phenomenon. And I'll talk about three particular patterns in Chinese character form, which I'll call reduplicative identity, idiosyncratic allomorphy, and regular reduction. So reduplication is shown in examples in 1, 2, and 3, which is a morphological, by analogy again with spoken and sign languages, it's a morphological process because it does have meaning, it has some interpretation. The phonological, the non-interpretable part, has to do with the form of it. So the one aspect is these templatic shapes. You get doubling horizontally or vertically, or get these triangle shapes. I'm going to focus in this talk on form identity, which is simply that the pieces in a reduplicated form have to be identical in some sense. Idiosyncratic allomorphy is allomorphy that's idiosyncratic. It only applies to certain character components. It's not regular. So in 4, for example, this wiggly thing becomes a 3-dotted thing, and this typically happens on the left side for a lot of these components. So like 4, 5, 6, 7, it's happening on the left side. And some of them do this on the bottom, like in 8. This is not a general pattern. This is just lexically specified for each component. Regular reduction, by contrast, is systematic. It applies to many, many components. Again, it usually happens on the left side. So diagonalization, horizontal strokes become a different stroke type, a rising stroke, and dotting, a falling diagonal, becomes a dot, which is a different stroke type. And this happens in many, many components, like so 9, 10, and dark 1 show the diagonalization, and dotting in 2, 3, and 4 in the highlighted strokes. So these processes seem to be orderable. You can describe a pattern, a kind of analysis where they have a particular order in synchronic forms. So I would argue that idiosyncratic allomorphy appears to apply before reduplicative identity. Two arguments for this. First, identity undoes allomorphy. So in examples 1, 2, and 3, for example, you can see in 1, the wiggly thing normally would become the 3-dot thing, but it is blocked from doing so in the reduplicated form. There are some exceptions. In fact, there's maybe just one exception in 4, where that seems to be semantically, morphologically reduplication, but you get this exceptional strange allomorphy. Another argument for the same point is that the allomorph itself, the derived allomorph, can be a force that requires identity to it, which in the reduplication literature is called backcopy. So in example 5 and 6, you can see this. So in 5, for example, the highlighted components are reduplicated, but what is reduplicated is the allomorph form, not the base form. So that, again, implies that you have already done the allomorphy before you applied identity. Idiosyncratic allomorphy also applies before regular reduction, and that's seen in examples 7, 8, and 9, because the derived allomorphs can undergo diagonalization and dotting. So, for example, in 7, this idiosyncratic allomorph, which originally has 4 strokes, now loses one of the strokes at the top for no particular reason. But at the same time, for regular reasons, the bottommost stroke becomes diagonal. And a similar thing happens in 9 with the dotting. And then finally, reduplicative identity applies before regular reduction, and that's because identity ignores these things. So identity says things should be identical in reduplicated forms, but it doesn't care if you've applied diagonalization or dotting. So in 10, for example, the 2 components are supposed to be identical. They're not actually identical because on the one on the left has this rising stroke on the bottom. So that implies it's applying later than identity. So you put these together in a synchronic ordering with 5 examples here. You first apply idiosyncratic allomorphy, which is lexically specified to only apply to the IA items, the idiosyncratic allomorphy items in columns 3, 4, and 5. And then you have reduplicative identity, which only applies to words that have or characters that have a R reduplicative morpheme in them. And then you finally have regular reduction to whatever's relevant to it. And you can see the reduplication stage in the column 4. You get the copying of the base to the reduplicant on the left, which is a normal way of reduplicating. But in the column 5, you get the reduplication the other way. So the allomorph itself is forcing or triggering identity in the base, and that's got to be lexically marked in that component as well. How do these patterns derive? What's the historical origin of these patterns? Do they match the synchronic ordering? So my source comes from a website which is very authoritative. There are some other websites online that supposedly tell you about character history, but they're not as reliable. This one is more scholarly. And some of the stages I'll be talking about, the oldest form of characters, oracle bones, and then bronze inscriptions. Small seal script was the first kind of standardized form. And then this rapid change in just 100, 200 years or so of so-called clerical script, and then finally modern traditional. We could continue on to simplified characters, of course, but I live in Taiwan, so I'll stop here. So we've seen these kind of pictures before. Column 1 in particular shows the obvious fact that iconicity is lost to a great degree. Things become more abstract and simple. The number of strokes often reduces as well. And of course, that continues into modern simplified characters. But I want you to look instead horizontally across each of these script systems. So small seal script, you can see that there's a kind of sameness, a kind of a similar look to all of these characters. And likewise for the modern traditional, they have their own look internal to the system. So reduplicative identity is the oldest pattern. It goes back to the oracle bones. It's already seen in the very earliest inscriptions as shown in 1, 2, and 3. Now, sometimes there are arrangements of reduplicated forms that have been changed or reanalyzed in modern characters, like in 4, 5, and 6. And that's because, as I mentioned, reduplication has two phonological aspects, this templatic process and the identity process. Identity is ancient. It's the oldest pattern that I'm talking about, but the templatic shape came a little bit later. So I'm not including that in my list because it doesn't interact with the other ones directly. Idiosyncratic allomorphy, which is the second of the patterns I've been talking about, came a little later than that even, and didn't actually appear until the development of clerical script, so quite late. So the irregular allomorphic changes in 1, 2, 3, 4 don't appear until the clerical script. You can see that in the highlighted components under the horizontal red line, which is when I see the change first appearing. So none of them are in the small seal script, but they appear later than that. Regular reduction appeared even later, or overlap a little bit, but a little bit later. So dotting was sometimes seen in clerical script. So if you look in columns 1 and 2, some characters show it and some characters don't show it. And in the diagonalization in column 3 only appears when you get to modern traditional characters. It doesn't. It must have happened after clerical script at some point. So diachronically, then we have the ordering of reduplication of identity, which is a pre-seal script phenomenon, then idiosyncratic allomorphy, which started in clerical script, and then regular reduction was after or late clerical script. Notice here the yellow arrow on the right side of column 5, which shows a kind of a reemergence of reduplication. So initially had a reduplicated form. It was reanalyzed as in terms of idiosyncratic allomorphy in clerical script, and then in modern script, it's become returned back to the reduplicated form, which already shows you that diachronic history is not explaining why the modern pattern is the way it is. So synchronically, idiosyncratic allomorphy comes before reduplication. Diachronically, reduplication came before idiosyncratic allomorphy. So the order of those two patterns is reversed. Both of them have regular reduction last. So what explains this synchronic order? Diachronic order doesn't explain it directly. Well, what I think what's going on is that regardless of diachronic order, the more productive a pattern, the later it seems to apply synchronically. So idiosyncratic allomorphy is the least productive of these three patterns because each allomorphic pattern is lexically restricted to a specific component, and allomorphs are in the lexicon, as shown by the fact that they're available for back copy. So it's a very unproductive process, and that's why it seems to be the first process synchronically. By contrast, reduplication is of intermediate productivity. So new coinages are rare. It's not used as a morphological process much anymore, but it is highly visually salient. So when you see these copied forms, it just kind of pops out to your eye. And this salience allows it to override idiosyncratic things like the lexicalized idiosyncratic allomorphy, because it is still kind of more mentally active. Reduction then is the most productive because it's motivated by what you might call phonetics, pen phonetics. I want to reemphasize that this is not physics. This patterns is obligatory even in mechanically printed type, but it's motivated in order to make the strokes of the final component, the left component, closer to the beginning of the next component. So that's why it's been maintained, because every time you write, you're kind of reminded of the advantage of these patterns. So it's very mentally active. So a lot more work needs to be done. I'm kind of vague about what I mean by productivity. Many other synchronic form patterns would have to be included in this, including hooking and what I call prosody. And their synchronic ordering turns out to be quite complex, as you can see in this paper on my homepage. If you know anything about historical linguistics, you know that my linear sequence of changes is misleading, because there's also geographical variation and idiolectical variation, which will complicate the whole story. And diachronic history after clerical script, between clerical script and now, I don't talk much about, and even after traditional script. So the changes that are systematized in the modern simplified script would also have to be included. More generally, I think we need a more nuanced analysis of writing system development. My impression is that the literature tends to focus narrowly on abstraction and simplification when they want to make great generalizations. Of course, there's a lot of individual stories, and sometimes people go beyond that. But I think more attention should be paid to the idea that diachronic change is actually a sequence of synchronic systems, rather than just looking at this grand overall trend. And finally, the most ambitious claim would be that speech signing and writing seem to share cognitive principles. And of course, we want to know how deep they actually go. Maybe that needs to be looked at a little harder. The end. Writing on paper, then you pick up new habits of writing. So the early ones, like the bronze inscriptions, that's like literally somebody carved them in clay and then they molded them and whatever. The other ones were kind of carved onto the earlier ones into bones and so on. At some point, people, of course, are using ink brushes, but they were writing on bamboo strips, which don't necessarily allow you to this flowing freedom that you might have with yeah. So I think paper. The answer is paper. Yes, that's when you suddenly get these dramatic changes in the rules. So yeah, of course, it's grammatical. It's not purely a cognitive thing, but yeah, there's some physical aspect to it as well, I think.
Fascinating. Thank you.